before listening to this sermon, if you could please read Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. I don't know if you've ever seen the following workers. They have special signs to announce that they'll be working. Men at work. They like to advertise that they'll be hard at work for several days. Work takes place here from the 27th of September to the 2nd of October. They announce that they're working. They announce that they'll be working for several days. And they even set up traffic lights so that we can all stop and watch them grafting. And yet, when you drive up, stop at the traffic lights, to the place where they're supposed to be working, there's no workmen in sight. I suspect that when you see this happening, it produces a certain reaction in you. Workmen who you never actually see at work. Workmen who spend most of the day contemplating work in the van. Or maybe you just get annoyed with workers who arrive late, leave early, and spend most of the day with their head in a newspaper or on their mobile phone. Such workers don't deserve the title workers, for they've no evidence of actually ever doing any work. And yet, in Jesus' parable, the Master gives the title workers to those he'd hired at 5 p.m, when all the real work had already been done. Verse 8, when evening came, that's after the first workers had worked a full 9 hours, and after the last people hired had worked just 1. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages." And each received a denarius, a day's wage. Get this, the Master gives those he'd hired last the title workers, and then he goes on to pay them as if they'd worked the full day. They'd stood around and done nothing from 9 to 5. They got hired after all the hard work had already been done. They'd walked to the vineyard, received an induction, rolled up their sleeves, and it was 6 p.m. Time to down tool and go to their master to get paid. These so-called workers don't even deserve the title workers. Not because they're lazy or work shy, but because they produce no evidence of having done any work. And yet the Master gives them the title workers and pays them as if they'd worked a full day. I don't know about you, but I'm so glad for the truth hidden in this parable. For so often I find it hard to believe what the Bible declares. I can't produce any evidence that I'm extra special or important. And yet the gospel gives me the title, Child of God. I can't produce a list of why God should infinitely value me. And yet the gospel calls his children his treasured possession. When I look at my own thoughts, my own life, I see evidence that I'm a sinner. And yet the gospel gives me the title, holy and blameless. Child of God, treasured possession, holy and blameless. I don't deserve these titles. You don't deserve these titles. But if you are a believer, these are the titles that God gives you. Like the last hour of the day workers in Jesus' parable, those who believe in Jesus are given a title, a wonderful new identity that they've done nothing to deserve. We've already heard of the amazing new identity. We sing of this amazing new identity in some of the songs that we sing at church. We are children of the promise, the beloved of the Lord, one with everlasting kindness, bought with sacrificial blood. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure. that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. For pure and blameless in his sight he destined us to be, and now we've been adopted through his Son eternally. We sing of the wonderful and new identity that comes through faith in Jesus. And yet you might still doubt it. Maybe you weren't beloved by your own parents, or maybe you're the type of person who is always overlooked. Maybe you know that your own thoughts and attitudes are far from pure, and you know that you've done things that are far from blameless. Maybe you've never been treasured by anybody. When you talk about yourself, people either pay no attention or start talking about themselves. Maybe you know things about yourself that are truly ugly. Like these workers who carried around the title of last hour workers, slackers, shamefully undeserving. You might have had labels attached to you, either by yourself or by others. Some of these labels might be true, some of them might be false. But the wonderful thing about Jesus is that he gives those who believe in him a new title, a wonderful new identity that you've done nothing to deserve. Child of God, treasured possession, holy and blameless in his sight. And we're completely undeserving of these titles. We're all in the category of completely undeserving. For none of us have given God the weight he is due in our lives. But instead we've all turned our back on him. And yet, so often we're like the first hour workers in Jesus' parable. Those who would like to think of themselves as more deserving than others. Chapter 20, verse 9. The workers who were hired about 5 p.m. came and each received a denarius, a day's wage. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. Those who were hired first began to grumble against the landowner. Those who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the heat of the day. In reality, we're all a bit like supermarkets. For supermarkets are always comparing themselves to others. Buy the same trolley of shopping at Lidl and save over £100 compared to Sainsbury's. Shop at Waitrose, take out a loan, and you will taste the difference. We may not have 100 different varieties of baked beans, but at Aldi's middle aisle, you'll find a wedding dress for your goldfish. Supermarkets, they're always comparing themselves to others in order to justify to us and themselves why they are better than the rest. And if it's not the price that makes them better, they'll find something else. Like supermarkets, we humans are the same. Always comparing ourselves to others. Always justifying to ourselves why we're better than somebody else. Maybe you're a co-op personality. Ethical, charitable, moral. Always judging the morally questionable actions of others. Always patting yourself on the back for being such a charitable person. Maybe you're an Aldi personality. Organised, efficient, gets the job done. You just get on with life, never complaining. Yet quick to criticise those who slow down to complain or who waste time on trivial things. Maybe you're an M&S personality, a food parlour that takes pride in its clotted cream profiteroles with a velvety chocolate sauce. Maybe you take pride in something. Maybe being kind, organised, hard-working. It's this that makes you feel superior and view others as not as great. Maybe you're an Iceland personality. If World War III strikes, you'll cope, ready with your freezer full of Viennetta and mixed veg. You're the type who's quick to criticize those who lack the emotional resources to cope with the basic troubles of every day. Maybe you're a different personality altogether. A Waitrose personality who looks down on the lower classes. A B&M bargains personality. Everybody loves you and no one's got a bad word to say. Or a Netto personality, profoundly aware that you're not as great as everybody else, and so you're often found in the corner, overlooked and ignored. Whatever categories you use to rank yourself or compare yourself to others, this parable reminds us that we're all the same. We all have the same need. Those hired first, those hired at noon, those hired at 5 p.m, all of them had the same need. If they weren't hired that day, there'd be no food at tea time. In that day, most people lived a hand-to-mouth existence. If the master didn't go out to hire them, they'd have all starved. Likewise, if God didn't look on each of us with compassion, we'd all be in the same boat. We'd all stand before God guilty. We'd all have stuff exposed about us that made us feel uncomfortable and ashamed. We'd all be fearful of the judgment to come. We all have the same need of forgiveness, and we're all recipients of the same thing. You know, every worker in the parable, no matter how deserving or undeserving, was a recipient of the same. They all got given a day's wage. And the same is true for every single Christian believer. We all receive the new identity of holy and blameless. I mean, none of us can say to Jesus' offer of forgiveness, "Oh, I don't need that." None of us can say, "Oh, I'm holy and blameless enough already." We all receive the new identity of treasured possession. None of us are more valued by God because of those supermarket qualities we thought about before. Strong or weak, gifted or not gifted, esteemed or overlooked. Because of Jesus, God looks on us all the same. God looks on us with 100% favour and with a magnificent love. We all have the same need, we're all the recipients of the same thing, and we're all dependent on God's generosity. Those hired first thought that the key factor, the decisive factor that determined the distribution of wages was the hours that they worked. Those hired last had hours to make up if they were to be rewarded with a full day's wages. Whereas those hired first, well, they'd done everything needed to qualify themselves for a day's wage. And yet the master ends by telling them this: I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? The master closes by pointing them away from themselves and pointing them to his generosity. In other words, the key factor in his reward scheme had nothing to do with them and everything to do with him being generous, compassionate and kind. So don't think to yourself when it comes to God. Don't think, because of this I deserve the attention of God, the centre of the universe. Don't think to yourself, well, I reckon I've done this. I reckon that qualifies me to receive God's infinitely valuable gifts. God is so generous. We can never do enough to earn his blessings. We can never do enough for him to repay him for what he's willing to do for us. So stop thinking so much of yourself and stop thinking so little of him. Some of you might spend your life thinking, I've got hours to make up in God's vineyard. I'm not serving God enough. I need to do more stuff to distract God's attention from all the bad. For God to look on me more favourably, I need to do X, Y, and Z. If this is you, listen. God is not looking for you to make up hours, or make yourself more acceptable, or more worthy, or more deserving. Stop thinking so little of Jesus by telling yourself these things. If you've got chapter 20 open, skim forward to verse 28. Jesus said, "The Son of Man," that's Jesus, "did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." On the cross, Jesus did everything needed to make you 100% acceptable to God. The blessings Jesus has earned for you do not need topping up. You don't need to spend the rest of your life convincing yourself or God or other people that you're that little bit more worthy. Jesus has done all that is needed already. Jesus has done all that is needed to make you pure and blameless in God's sight. Jesus has done all that is needed to earn God's eternal favour. God's favour towards you has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with his generosity, expressed in his Son, Jesus Christ. And when you remember this is the difference it will make. It'll make a difference to you pointing out the sins of others. I don't know, just it might feel strange, but maybe just get a bit of paper, and I'd like you to write on it something that you're ashamed of or embarrassed about, or something silly which you'd go red in the face if people found out. Write it on a bit of paper and place it on your head. Now you could walk around your church and nobody could look down on you for what's written on that bit of paper. The reason nobody can look down on what's on that bit of paper is because you're all stood on the same surface. You're all at ground level, and so nobody can see that thing that's on the top of your head. The only way somebody can look down on you and look down on that thing is if someone takes themselves off the surface that you're all stood on and stands on something else, such as a chair or a table. So I put that down. When we're all stood on the same surface, none of us can look down on anybody else and take the mick out of them. Whereas if one of us stands on something different, stands on top of a chair or a table, only then can we look down on each other, mock each other, and ridicule each other for these things that are written on these bits of paper. You'll notice something similar happening in verse 12 of Jesus' parable. Those who have hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us. In reality, all these workers were dependent on the master's generosity. In that sense, they were all on the same level. But the moment these 9 a.m. workers built their life on something else, their criticism and pride began to arise. The 9 a.m. workers began to build their life on the principle that they were more or less deserving, depending on how much you worked. And because they worked harder than others, they began looking down on others, pointing out the slackness of everybody else. When you find yourself criticizing or judging or condemning another Christian, it's usually a symptom that you're doing the same. But how can you judge, condemn, and criticize another Christian when we're all stood on the same level? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace. How can we look down on another Christian when our lives are built around the same truth? It is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. The only way you and I can criticize another believer or another church is if we begin building our life on something else, something other than the gospel. If you build your life around how hard-working you are, you'll begin looking down on those who work less hard. If you build your life around how mentally resilient you are, you'll begin looking down on those weak people who find things a struggle. If you build your life on anything other than the gospel, you'll find yourself judging, criticizing, and condemning other people all the time. And you know what the scary thing is? Christians like me are often the best people at doing these things. Criticizing other churches, judging other believers, pointing out the sins of everybody else but ourselves. I find myself doing these things all the time. And though there are occasions where this may be necessary, lovingly correcting somebody or maybe warning others, though there are sometimes occasions when it might be necessary, I usually do it because I begin building my life on something else. I begin building my life on something that makes me better than other people, and so I look down on everybody else. But when we build our lives on the gospel, it puts us all on the same level, and it will keep us from pointing out the sins of others. And also, it will also keep us from pointing out how great we are. Verse 10. Those who were hired first began to grumble against the landowner. Those who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. Now, whenever I, a nurse, start night shift, I usually find day shifts sat at the desk at the end of the working day. Everybody knows that they could be sat at the desk for one of two reasons. Reason 1, they're lazy, or reason 2, which is probably more likely the case, they've worked really hard and all the work has already been done. Now, absolutely no nurse wants to be labelled as lazy. Every nurse wants the title of hardest working nurse in the world. And for these reasons, when night shift arrive at the end of the day, every nurse feels they need to point certain facts out. Look at the 10,000 steps I've done today on my Fitbit. Measure the toilet roll. I've not had time to use the toilet all day. Look at my water bottle. I've not even had the chance to take a single sip. Look, pay attention. I've borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. Like nurses, like these 9 a.m. workers in the parable, like all of us, so often we feel compelled to say things to boost our reputation. We don't want the title of lazy or unkind or selfish, but we want a better title for ourselves instead. Good, nice, kind, hard-working. But if you believe the gospel, you've no need to boost your reputation. You've no need to prove you deserve a better title, for the greatest title has been given to you already. Reading some selected verses from the book of Ephesians, chapter 1. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, for he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and will, towards those who are God's possession. If you are a believer, you have received the title of holy and blameless. Therefore you can openly confess the worst about yourself without fear of your position before God being changed. If you are a believer, you've received the title of child of God. You've received the title of treasured possession. Therefore you don't need to do things or say things to earn yourself a better title, for the best title in the world has been given to you already.